The rain hammers Seoul's Gangnam district like bullets against glass. Neon signs bleed into the wet pavement, crimson, electric blue, sickly white, casting everything in the glow of controlled chaos. This is where power moves in whispers and disappearances are arranged over coffee. A black Mercedes rolls to a stop outside a luxury high-rise. The kind of building where men in suits conduct business that ends lives. The rear door opens. Kang Min-soo steps out first. 42 years old, tailored Versace suit perfectly pressed despite the rain, dark eyes that scan the world like a predator counting prey. His bodyguards form an immediate barrier, hands resting near concealed weapons. They have learned to read his silence. They have learned to fear his calm. Min-soo moves forward, toward the building's entrance. Then he stops. A small black puppy sits directly in his path. Not begging. Not barking. Not whimpering. Just sitting there. Soaked and shaking, staring up at him with eyes that seem impossibly aware. The puppy doesn't flinch as Min-soo approaches. It doesn't run. It simply watches him with an intensity that feels almost deliberate. One of his bodyguards reaches for it. "Sir, I'll leave it," Min-soo says quietly. He steps around the puppy and continues inside. But the puppy's eyes follow him. That night, Min-soo doesn't sleep. He tells himself it was nothing, just a stray dog seeking shelter. By morning, he has already forgotten about it. His empire demands attention. A rival gang is moving into his territory. Money needs to be laundered. Debts need to be collected. He steps out of his penthouse the next evening. The black puppy is waiting outside his building. Not one street away. Not coincidentally nearby. Right there asterisk. At the exact spot he emerges, as if it had been waiting all day. As if it knew he would come out. Min-soo's jaw tightens. He has faced assassins without blinking. He has ordered deaths without hesitation. He has built an empire on the broken backs of people he erased from memory within hours. But this puppy, this small, impossible creature, refuses to be erased. And for the first time in 20 years, Kang Min-soo feels something he cannot control: unease. This man has destroyed countless lives without losing sleep. So why is he unable to walk past a dying puppy? Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you and know how far our story is going. The penthouse of Kang Min-soo occupied the top 3 floors of the Songbuk Tower, a glass and steel monument to his rise through Seoul's underworld. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he had systematically conquered, block by block, deal by deal, life by life. At night, the city became a circuit board of lights and neon. Beautiful, cold, and entirely indifferent to human suffering. Min-soo stood at the window now, a tumbler of 30-year-old whiskey in his hand, watching the rain begin to fall across those glittering streets. Behind him, the penthouse hummed with the weight of his wealth. Italian marble floors. Original paintings he had never bothered to authenticate. Furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year. Everything was designed to communicate the same message. I have won. I have risen above you. I am untouchable. Yet as Min-soo stood in the silence of his empire, he felt nothing. The glass in his hand reflected his face, sharp features, dark eyes, a jawline that had grown harder with each year. At 42, he looked carved from stone. The kind of face that made people look away first. The kind of face that had ordered deaths without flinching, had watched men disappear, had erased entire families from Seoul's streets. His hands, which now held the whiskey with casual elegance, had once held a knife. His voice, which now commanded boardrooms, had once whispered orders that ended lives. He had built an empire. But empires, Min-soo had learned, were prisons. He turned from the window and moved through the penthouse with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned to move through the world as a weapon. Every step was calculated. Every gesture was controlled. He had trained himself so thoroughly in the language of power that he sometimes wondered if he remembered how to speak any other language. The answer, increasingly, seemed to be no. His phone buzzed. A message from his lieutenant, Park Jin-ho. The Busan crew is asking for a meeting. They want territory in Gangnam. Min-soo didn't respond immediately. He walked to a wall where photographs were arranged in a precise grid. Images of his rise. Min-soo shaking hands with corrupt politicians. Min-soo with beautiful women draped on his arm. Min-soo standing over rivals who had fallen. Each photograph was a chapter in his war against the world. But there was one photograph he had never quite looked at directly. It hung at the edge of the grid, slightly obscured by the angle of the light, almost as if it had been placed there by accident. The image was old, the colors faded, and it showed a small neighborhood street in what looked like the early 2000s. A woman stood in a doorway, smiling at the camera. Behind her, a young girl peered out, her expression caught between curiosity and shyness. The photograph was from a time when Min-soo was still building his empire, when he was learning which doors to kick in and which people to erase. He never looked at that photograph. He didn't know why it was there. His interior decorator had probably placed it as some kind of artistic statement. Min-soo's eyes passed over it now without registering anything, and he moved on. He typed a response to Jin-ho. Tell the Busan crew to meet me tomorrow night. The usual place. Then he poured another whiskey and waited for tomorrow to arrive. The Obsidian Club occupied the basement level of a nondescript building in the heart of Gangnam's red light district. To anyone passing on the street, it was simply another establishment where Seoul's wealthy came to lose their money and their morality. In reality, it was one of Min-soo's most profitable operations. The gambling, the women, the drugs, all of it flowed upward into his carefully constructed financial empire, then dispersed outward to politicians, police, and judges who had learned to look the other way. Min-soo descended the stairs into the club just after midnight. The air was thick with smoke and perfume, layered with the desperate energy of men willing away their fortunes. He moved through the club without stopping, without acknowledging anyone, a ghost moving through the underbelly of his own creation. The meeting room was on the second basement level, accessible only through a private elevator. When Min-soo entered, the Busan crew was already waiting. 5 men in expensive suits, their leader a man named Choi Dong-hae who had the broad shoulders and scarred knuckles of someone who had fought his way upward. Kang Min-soo, Dong-hae said, standing to shake his hand. Thank you for the meeting. Seat. Min-soo said, not shaking his hand. He moved to the head of the table, and the men immediately repositioned themselves, creating a hierarchy that Min-soo's simple command had established. We want Gangnam, Dong-hae said without preamble. The Western District. We're willing to pay 20% of all operations into your organization. You maintain control. We run the day-to-day. It's a reasonable proposition. Min-soo studied the man across from him. Dong-hae had made a mistake by coming here. By asking for anything. By suggesting that the territory was negotiable. The Western District had belonged to Min-soo for 7 years. 7 years of careful cultivation, of relationships built, and threats carefully calibrated, of people removed when they became inconvenient. No. Min-soo said simply. We can negotiate. Dong-hae said, leaning forward. Fair. 25%. That's more than. The answer is no. Min-soo interrupted. And I'm going to give you some free advice. Free. Because I'm in a generous mood. Stop asking me for permission to operate in my city. Stop coming to Seoul. Stop existing in any form that requires me to be aware of you. The temperature in the room dropped. The other men shifted uncomfortably. Donasiav tightened. You're making a mistake. Min-soo continued. You think you can come here and negotiate with me because you've built something in Busan. You think that means we're equals. We're not. I could have you eliminated in the time it takes you to finish drinking that water. I could have your family erased by next week. The only reason you're still alive is because you don't matter enough to me to bother. Don't change that calculation. He stood, and the meeting was over. You have 48 hours to leave Seoul. he said as he walked toward the door. My men will find you, and the conversation will be very different. After that, he didn't wait for a response. He left the meeting room and took the private elevator back up. Through the Obsidian Club. Behind him, Dong-hae and his men sat in stunned silence, understanding that they had just received a death sentence wrapped in the courtesy of an appointment. This was how Min-soo conducted business. Not with anger or shouting, but with the cold certainty of a man who controlled outcomes. Emotion was a weakness. Mercy was a liability. The only way to maintain power in Seoul's underworld was to be more ruthless than everyone else, more willing to pay the cost, more capable of looking directly into the eyes of a dying man, and feeling absolutely nothing. He emerged from the Obsidian Club into a Gangnam street slick with rain. His bodyguards formed their immediate protective barrier, and his driver brought the Mercedes around. Min-soo was about to slide into the back seat when something made him pause. A black puppy sat on the sidewalk directly in front of the club's entrance. It was small, barely more than a few months old, with matted fur that suggested it had been living on the streets for weeks. One of its ears was torn, and there was a gash along its left side that looked infected. The puppy should have been cowering. It should have run at the sight of Min-soo and his men. Instead, it simply sat there, staring up at him with eyes that seemed impossibly aware. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, Min-soo felt something shift inside his chest. It was unfamiliar and deeply unwelcome. He pushed it away immediately. What is that? He said, his voice hard. A dog, sir. One of his bodyguards said. I'll have it removed. The guard reached down to grab the puppy, but it sidestepped the motion with surprising agility, still keeping its eyes fixed on Min-soo. The puppy didn't growl or bark. It simply refused to break its gaze. Leave it, Min-soo said, surprising himself. It's just a dog. He slid into the back of the Mercedes, and his driver pulled away from the curb. In the side mirror, Min-soo watched the black puppy recede into the distance, still sitting on the wet sidewalk, its eyes following the car until the darkness of the Gangnam street swallowed everything. Min-soo told himself he had already forgotten it by the time they reached his penthouse. The next morning, Min-soo stood in his office on the 15th floor of an office building that officially belonged to an import-export company. In reality, it was the command center of his operations. Maps on the walls showed territories color-coded by profit and control. Computer screens displayed the flow of money through his network. Charts tracked the rise and fall of rival gangs. He was reviewing quarterly earnings with his accountant when his phone buzzed. A message from his security team. Unidentified dog spotted outside the building. Should we remove it? Min-soo frowned. He didn't bother responding. Dogs appeared and disappeared in Seoul all the time. It was coincidence. Nothing more. But when he left the office building that afternoon, he saw it. The black puppy sat in the exact spot where his car would emerge from the underground garage. As the Mercedes rolled toward it, Min-soo expected the animal to scatter. Instead it stood, the movement smooth and deliberate, and trotted alongside the car as it moved into traffic. His driver took several turns trying to lose it, weaving through congested streets, but the puppy matched every movement. It ran alongside the Mercedes with a determination that seemed almost impossible for an animal so small and injured. Finally, at a red light, Min-soo leaned forward. Stop, he said. The car pulled to the side of the road. Min-soo opened the door and stepped out, and the black puppy stood before him, breathing heavily, its sides heaving from the exertion. Up close he could see how thin it was, how the wounds on its body had begun to fester, how its left rear leg had a pronounced limp. What do you want? Min-soo said, his voice strange to his own ears. The puppy tilted its head, as if considering the question, then simply sat down. It didn't beg. It didn't whimper. It simply sat and looked at him with those eyes that seemed to contain knowledge or judgment, or something Min-soo couldn't quite name. A car honked behind them. Min-soo got back into the Mercedes, and the driver continued. In the Mirror, he watched the puppy attempt to follow, limping but determined, until the traffic separated them. That evening at his penthouse, Min-soo stood at the window overlooking the city and tried to focus on his work. Numbers and spreadsheets blurred together. His mind kept drifting back to that limp, that determined expression, those eyes. At precisely 9 o'clock, his security team reported that the black puppy had been spotted outside his penthouse complex. How? Min-soo asked. How is it at multiple locations in a single day? We don't know, sir. His chief security officer said. It appears to be following you. We have no explanation for how it moves so quickly, or how it locates your movements. Min-soo felt the first tendrils of genuine unease. In his world, nothing happened without explanation. Everything could be controlled, anticipated, managed. But this small injured creature that appeared and reappeared, that followed him across the city with impossible precision, defied every rule he had established about how the world worked. Watch it, he said. But don't harm it. I want to know how it's doing this. He hung up and returned to the window. Below, in the pool of light cast by the building's security lamps, he could see the black puppy sitting in the courtyard, staring up toward his penthouse. Even from this distance, he could feel the weight of its gaze. For the first time in 20 years, Kang Min-soo experienced the sensation of being hunted. 3 days passed. The puppy had become a constant presence, appearing outside his office building, waiting at his nightclub, sitting in the courtyard of his penthouse. Min-soo's security team had intensified their surveillance, trying to understand how the animal moved, how it anticipated his movements, how it managed to find him across the sprawling expanse of Seoul. They found nothing. No explanation. No owner. No explanation for why it continued to appear. Injured and suffering, apparently driven by nothing more than the compulsion to follow. On the 4th day, Min-soo saw the infection had worsened. The puppy's left rear leg had begun to swell, and it limped more severely with each passing day. There was infection in the wounds along its side, and when the puppy tried to move quickly, it stumbled. Min-soo watched from his office window as the animal lay in the courtyard below, breathing shallowly, clearly in pain but still maintaining vigil. That night, he dreamed for the first time in years. In the dream, he was walking down a street he didn't recognize. The buildings were old, the kind that dotted Seoul's outer neighborhoods, the places where poor people lived and died without fanfare. A fire was burning somewhere, consuming everything, and through the smoke, he could see figures running, screaming names that he couldn't quite hear. He was standing in the center of it all, watching, feeling nothing, and then the smoke cleared, and there was a girl standing in front of him. She was young, maybe 15, with dark eyes and a gravity to her expression that seemed impossible for someone her age. She was staring at him the way the puppy stared at him. He woke suddenly, his heart racing, and found that dawn was breaking across Seoul. It was barely past 5 in the morning, but sleep was no longer possible. Min-soo got out of bed and showered in scalding water, trying to wash away the residue of the dream. He told himself it meant nothing. Dreams were the mind's garbage disposal, senseless accumulations of subconscious debris, meaningless. By the time he left his penthouse to drive to his office, the dream had begun to fade, and he was back to focusing on the practical concerns of managing his empire. But when his car was 3 blocks away from his office building, his driver suddenly swerved, nearly causing an accident. What are you doing? Min-soo demanded. The dog, sir. His driver said, his voice shaking. It ran directly into traffic. I almost hit it. Min-soo leaned forward and looked behind them. The black puppy was limping across the street, its injured leg nearly useless, but it was following the Mercedes with the same grim determination it had shown from the beginning. This time, Min-soo didn't turn away. Stop the car, he said. They pulled to the side of the road, and Min-soo got out. The puppy was struggling to reach him. Its breathing labored, its body clearly operating beyond the limits of its pain tolerance. When it finally reached him, it simply collapsed, unable to continue. Min-soo stared down at the injured animal for what felt like an eternity. Every rational part of his brain told him to walk away. He was a man of power. He didn't care for small creatures. Didn't allow sentiment to guide his decisions. Dogs were nothing. This dog was less than nothing. But standing over the collapsed puppy, seeing the way its sides heaved with painful breaths, Min-soo felt something crystallize inside him. A crack in the carefully constructed walls of his emotional architecture. "Call a veterinarian," he said to his. She said, "Do you know who this dog belonged to?" Min-soo felt something cold move down his spine. "No," he said. "I don't." "The dog is wearing a collar," the veterinarian said. "There's a name tag. It says Mercy. And there's a photograph in the collar, old, faded. Someone cared for this dog very much. Someone spent time training it, teaching it. This is not a stray that randomly decided to follow you. This is a dog that was sent to find you." Min-soo felt the room shift around him. He couldn't breathe properly. The walls seemed to be narrowing. "Do you remember?" the veterinarian continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "A family that lived in the western neighborhood 5 years ago. A woman and her daughter. They had a small apartment on Mercy Street." The name of the street hung in the air like a curse that Min-soo's hands had begun to shake. He clasped them together, trying to maintain control, but it was crumbling. The walls he had built around himself, the emotional fortress he had constructed over decades, were fracturing. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice was barely a whisper. "You ordered an eviction," the veterinarian continued. "A fire followed. It was supposed to look accidental. The mother died in that fire. The daughter survived, but she left Seoul. Before she left, she found this puppy and spent 2 years training it. She recorded her scent, her voice in that dog's memory. But more importantly, she trained it to recognize only one face. Your face." The veterinarian held up the photograph that had been in the collar. It was the same photograph that hung on Min-soo's wall. The woman in the doorway. The girl peering out. And now in the back corner of the image, barely visible, was a small puppy, not yet grown. "She never got the life she deserved," the veterinarian said. "But she made sure that you would remember, that you would feel, that somewhere deep inside yourself, you would have to confront what you did." Min-soo couldn't respond. He turned away from the veterinarian and stumbled toward the waiting room. His bodyguards immediately moved to support him, confused by his sudden loss of composure. "Get me home," he said, his voice breaking. In the back of the Mercedes, with his men trying not to look at him, Kang Min-soo, the man who had spent 20 years learning not to feel, learning to be a weapon, learning to be untouchable, sat in the back seat with tears streaming down his face, and finally, for the first time since the girl whose life he had erased had looked at him in that photograph, he began to remember. That night, Min-soo stood at his penthouse window, unable to sleep, unable to move. The city below him seemed suddenly different. No longer a landscape of conquest and control, but a landscape of ghosts. Ghosts of people he had ordered destroyed. Ghosts of families separated. Ghosts of the woman who had died in the fire on Mercy Street. His phone buzzed. A message from his security chief, the Busan crew. "They're making moves. They're testing our control of the Western District. Should we respond?" Min-soo stared at the message for a long time. In the old world, in the world he had spent 20 years constructing, the answer would be clear. Respond with overwhelming force. Eliminate the threat. Maintain absolute control. But he thought of the puppy, lying in the veterinary clinic, barely clinging to life. He thought of the girl who had trained it. He thought of the woman who had died that he didn't respond to the message. Instead, he walked to the wall where his photographs hung, and for the first time he looked directly at the image of the woman and the girl on Mercy Street. He stared at that photograph for a long time, and finally he allowed himself to see them. Not as obstacles to be removed, but as people who had existed, who had mattered, who had deserved a life that he had stolen from them. Outside, in the courtyard of his penthouse, the black puppy waited, recovering in a veterinary cell, trained by a girl to recognize this man's face. Trained to find him. Trained to make him see. And in the morning, when Min-soo woke from fitful sleep, he understood that his life had divided into two parts. The time before the black puppy, and everything that came after. He had no idea yet what that meant. But standing at his window, watching the rain fall across Seoul, Kang Min-soo, the man who had built an empire on the broken backs of the forgotten, felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. He felt fear. Not of his enemies, not of assassination attempts or rival gangs. He felt fear of what came next. Of what he might have to do to undo the damage he had caused. Of whether redemption was even possible for a man like him. The black puppy waited below, recovering with each passing hour. And in that waiting was a question that Min-soo could no longer ignore. A question about who he was. A question about who he could become. A question about whether a man built entirely from cruelty could learn, at last, how to feel. What do you think Min-soo will do when he finally brings Mercy home? Will redemption be enough? The veterinary clinic was quiet in the early morning hours. Min-soo had spent the entire night there, sitting in the waiting room under fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and surreal. His bodyguards waited in the hallway, maintaining a discreet distance, not understanding why their boss had decided to camp out in a veterinary clinic like some kind of anxious civilian waiting for news of a family member. At 6:47 a.m. Dr. Han emerged from the back surgical suite. She was still wearing her surgical mask, pulled down around her neck, and her eyes were tired but kind. Min-soo stood. Immediately, every muscle in his body tense. The puppy made it through the night. Dr. Han said. The infection was worse than I initially thought, and the rear leg is definitely broken, but it's healing improperly. We've addressed the infection and reset the leg as best we could. It will need physical therapy, but the animal is strong. Stronger than it should be, given what it's been through. Min-soo felt something release in his chest, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. Relief, perhaps. Or the loosening of a tension he had been carrying since the moment he saw the puppy collapse on that Seoul street. When can I see it? He asked. Now if you'd like. But it's sedated. It will sleep for several more hours. Dr. Han led him back through the clinic to a recovery room where the black puppy lay on a padded bed, bandaged and still, breathing shallowly. And 4 drip ran into its front leg. Monitoring. Equipment beeped softly, tracking the animal's vital signs. Min-soo stood in the doorway, unable to move forward or backward, caught in a moment of profound displacement. This puppy, this small creature that had pursued him relentlessly across Seoul, was now his responsibility. He had ordered that it be saved at any cost, and the cost had been considerable. But more than that, the puppy represented something he could no longer avoid. A message. A judgment. A confrontation with a part of his past that he had successfully buried for 5 years. I need to see the collar, Min-soo said suddenly. The one you removed from the dog. Dr. Han fetched it, a simple collar, worn and faded, the kind that a poor family might use. Attached to it was a small name tag, and wrapped around the tag was a photograph so old and fragile it seemed like it might disintegrate if handled too roughly. Min-soo took the photograph with fingers that had begun to shake. It was a picture of a young girl, maybe 13 or 14, with dark skin and eyes that held a gravity beyond her years. She was holding a puppy, much smaller than, barely more than a few weeks old. And she was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was equal parts determination and sorrow. The back of the photograph had writing on it, in careful English letters. Asterisk, I will make you. Remember. I will make you feel. This is Mercy. She will find you. Asterisk. Min-soo's legs gave out, and he sat down heavily in the nearest chair. The photograph trembled. In his hands. The dog belonged to her? Dr. Han asked gently, reading the situation with the intuition that years of working with grieving pet owners had developed in her. Min-soo couldn't speak. He stared at the photograph, at the girl's eyes, at the determination in her young face. She had been just a child. She had been just a child, and he had. The thought wouldn't complete itself. It fractured against the wall of his denial and broke into pieces. Yes, he finally said, his voice barely audible. The dog belonged to her. That afternoon, Min-soo sat in his penthouse with his most trusted lieutenant, Park Jin-ho, and gave him instructions that would have seemed insane just 24 hours earlier. Find everything you can about the Mercy Street eviction 5 years ago, Min-soo said. The residents, the families, everyone who lived there. I want names, current locations, everything. Jin-ho's expression shifted into confusion. Would you? Sir, that was years ago. It's ancient history. Why? Do it. Min-soo cut him off. And don't ask questions. Just find them. By evening, Jin-ho returned with a file. Min-soo read through it with a growing sense of horror, as if he were watching footage of another man's crimes, another man's cruelty. But it wasn't. It was him. Every page was his doing. The eviction had been straightforward, a low-income neighborhood that sat on land Min-soo wanted to develop into luxury apartments. The residents had refused to leave voluntarily. So, Min-soo had ordered a fire. An accidental fire that would make the buildings uninhabitable and force the evacuation. The fire had been set efficiently, professionally. It had worked exactly as planned. Except the mother of the girl from the photograph hadn't made it out. The report listed her name, Amara Williams. Age 38 at the time of death. Single parent. Worked as a nurse. Had a daughter, Zara Williams, age 15. There was a note that the daughter had survived the fire and had been taken in by social services, then later adopted by relatives. Current location unknown. There was a small photograph attached to Amara's file. She was wearing a nurse's uniform, smiling at the camera in a way that suggested she had been a woman of warmth and kindness. The kind of woman who saved lives for a living. The kind of woman Min-soo had ordered. Erased. Min-soo closed the file and couldn't open his eyes for several minutes. Sir? Jin-ho's voice came from somewhere distant. Are you all right? Find her, Min-soo said. Find Zara Williams. I don't care if it takes months. Find her. Find who? Jin-ho asked, but one look at Min-soo's face told him not to pursue the question further. That night, Min-soo returned to the veterinary clinic. The puppy was awake now, groggy from the sedatives, and it lifted its head when Min-soo entered the recovery room. He sat on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch the dog's head gently, careful not to disturb any of the bandages or the foreline. Mercy, he whispered, testing the name. Is that what she called you? Is that what you are? The puppy's eyes focused on him with that same penetrating awareness that had followed him across Seoul. It was as if the animal possessed knowledge that transcended normal canine understanding, as if it carried within it a message from the girl who had trained it, who had loved it, who had sent it out into the world with a single purpose, to find the man who had destroyed her life and force him to see what he had done. Min-soo sat there for hours, his hand resting on the puppy's head, and in the silence of the veterinary clinic he began to do something he hadn't done since childhood, that he began to pray. The memories came in fragments, refusing to organize themselves into a coherent narrative. Min-soo had spent 5 years not thinking about Mercy Street, not thinking about the eviction, not thinking about the details of what he had done. His mind had learned to compartmentalize, to separate the orders he gave from the consequences they produced, to exist in a state of willful ignorance about the human cost of his empire. But now the fragments were surfacing, and he couldn't force them back down. He remembered the report his men had given him about the fire. One casualty. A woman named Amara Williams. They had expected him to feel something about that, or perhaps they had simply expected him to acknowledge it as a necessary loss. But he had felt nothing then. Had filed it away in the same mental category as all the other losses, all the other victims, all the other lives that had ended because they had stood in the way of his ambitions. Now 5 years later, sitting in a veterinary clinic with a puppy that had been trained to find him. He felt the full weight of that indifference. It crashed down on him like a physical force, and for the first time, he understood what his bodyguards must have always known but never articulated: that he was not a man. He was a machine that had learned to speak and move like a man, but inside, where humanity should have been, there was only emptiness and the infinite capacity for cruelty. The girl Zara had been 15 years old. 15. She had watched her mother die in a fire. She had grieved. She had survived. And rather than seek revenge in the traditional sense, rather than send assassins or attempt to destroy him through violence, she had chosen something far more devastating. She had chosen to make him remember. She had chosen to make him feel. She had trained a dog to find him, and she had disappeared from Seoul, knowing that this puppy would hunt him across the city until he had no choice but to confront what he had done. It was the cruelest mercy imaginable. 2 weeks later, the puppy was released from the veterinary clinic. Dr. Han had overseen its recovery personally, and she had watched with subtle satisfaction as the man who had arrived in her clinic, broken and shattered, had slowly, incrementally, begun to reassemble himself into something that vaguely resembled a human being. Min-soo brought Mercy home to the penthouse. He had prepared a room for the animal, the kind of luxury that would have seemed obscene to anyone who knew his history. A padded bed, toys, specially prepared food. He spent hours each day with the puppy, watching as it recovered, learning to walk again on its healed rear leg, relearning the basic movements of a healthy animal. But even as Mercy recovered, Min-soo unraveled. He stopped going to the Obsidian Club, the gambling operations, the drug trade, the various schemes that had generated his wealth. They suddenly seemed not just morally abhorrent, but actively repulsive. He couldn't bear to think about what they represented, what lives they had destroyed, how many more families had been shattered by his pursuit of power. Jin-ho came to him with reports of the Busan crew making moves, of other rivals sensing weakness, of the empire beginning to crumble. Min-soo listened to these reports with a kind of disinterested detachment. The empire had begun to seem like a monument to meaninglessness, a tower of violence and suffering built on a foundation of human pain. What should we do about the Western District? Jin-ho asked. Power. If we don't respond, the Busan crew is consolidating. Let them have it. Min-soo said quietly. Sir. Let them have all of it. The entire district. I don't want it anymore. Jin-ho stared at him as if his boss had suddenly begun speaking an alien language. I don't understand. The Western District is worth millions. The Busan crew isn't strong enough to hold it against us if we... I said let them have it. Min-soo repeated, his voice carrying the same weight of authority it always had, just pointed in a completely different direction. And tell them that if they harm anyone in that neighborhood, I will burn them out. But otherwise it's theirs. For the first time in his professional relationship with Min-soo, Jin-ho felt something resembling fear. Not fear of his boss's violence, but fear of his boss's dissolution. Whatever was happening to Kang Min-soo, it was something that threatened to take down everything they had built. That night, Jin-ho came back with information about Zara Williams. She had been adopted by an aunt who lived in Vancouver. She had completed high school there, then had gone to university to study social work. She had spent the last 5 years working with at-risk youth in Vancouver's low-income neighborhoods, trying to prevent the kind of victimization that had claimed her mother. She was alive. She was whole. She had built a life out of the ashes of the one Min-soo had destroyed. And she had never forgotten. The puppy she had trained, Mercy, had been a message sent across time and distance. A message that said, *I survived. I'm building something better. And you will acknowledge what you did. Min-soo read the report on Zara Williams 3 times. He learned everything there was to know about her present life. He learned that she had never married, never had children, seemed to have devoted her entire existence to helping people who had been broken by circumstance and cruelty. He learned that her therapist's notes obtained through contacts in Canada, suggested. She struggled with trauma and grief, that she had never fully processed her mother's death, that she had sublimated her pain into her work with at-risk youth. All of it because of him. All of it his fault. And instead of feeling guilt that would motivate him toward change, instead of feeling shame that would drive him to seek forgiveness, Min-soo felt something else entirely. He felt gratitude. Gratitude that Zara had survived. Gratitude that she had built a life worth living. Gratitude that, instead of becoming a victim or a perpetrator like the people he had created through his violence, she had become a healer. He sat in his penthouse with Mercy curled up beside him, and he allowed himself to imagine what it would have been like to be a good man. A man who had used his intelligence and drive to build things instead of destroy them. A man who had loved people instead of viewing them as obstacles. A man who had seen the world as something to nurture instead of something to conquer. That man did not exist. Min-soo could not become that man. Too much had been done in his name. Too many lives had been destroyed. The empire he had built was not a structure that could be reformed or redeemed. It was a monument to cruelty, and the only honest response to it was to dismantle it completely. Over the course of the next 6 months, Kang Min-soo did something that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had known him before the arrival of the black puppy. He began to disassemble his empire. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But it was something. It was the beginning of something that might eventually become acknowledgement, restitution, change. The Western District of Seoul had once been home to families like the Williamses, families of working poor immigrants, people trying to survive in a city that had no patience for them. It had been ravaged by Min-soo's operations, exploited for its location and its vulnerability. Now with the Busan crew having taken control, and Min-soo having stepped back from direct involvement, the neighborhood began to show signs of recovery. But recovery wasn't enough. Min-soo knew what he wanted to do, and it would require him to reveal himself in a way he had never allowed before. It would require him to acknowledge publicly what he had done, to face the consequences of his actions not just internally but externally, in the eyes of the city that had known him as its most feared and powerful criminal. He hired architects and urban planners. He purchased properties throughout the Western District. He began to rebuild, not luxury apartments, not developments designed to extract wealth from vulnerable people. Instead, he rebuilt housing for low-income residents. He created a community center. He funded schools and programs for at-risk youth. He poured millions into transforming the neighborhood from a place of exploitation into a place of hope. And in the center of it all, he commissioned a memorial. It was a simple structure, a wall of stone with names carved into it. Names of people who had been killed in Min-soo's operations over the course of 20 years. Families destroyed. Lives erased. The memorial was a public confession, a record carved in stone of the human cost of his ambition. Amara Williams's name was prominent on the wall, and her photograph was displayed prominently, so that anyone who passed through the neighborhood would know her face, would know that she had existed, that she had been a nurse and a mother and a woman of kindness. The day the memorial was unveiled, Min-soo stood in front of it with Mercy beside him. The dog was healthy now, fully recovered, its injuries healed into scars that marked it as a survivor. The puppy had remained at his side through all of these changes, and Min-soo had come to understand that the animal was not just a messenger but a companion, perhaps the only being in the world who knew him completely and did not judge him. A small group of journalists had been invited to cover the event. They photographed Min-soo standing before the memorial, his hand resting on Mercy's head. The image would become iconic. The feared Mafia boss, brought low by a trained dog, finally forced to acknowledge the cost of his reign. The story that emerged from this image was one that captured the imagination of Seoul. How a random dog had driven a criminal to redemption. How the power of a single determined animal had accomplished what law enforcement had never been able to achieve. The story was picked up by national news outlets, then international ones. It became a parable about transformation, about the possibility of change even for those who had seemed unchangeable. But Min-soo knew the truth. The change was not complete. It would never be complete. The people he had hurt could not be unhurt. The families he had destroyed could not be restored. Amara Williams could not be brought back to life. Zara Williams could not be given back the childhood that had been stolen from her. All Min-soo could do was acknowledge what had been done, dismantle the structures that had perpetuated the harm, and spend the rest of his life attempting to be less of a cancer on the world than he had been before. It was not redemption. It was only the beginning of accountability. That first night after the memorial unveiling, Min-soo stood at the penthouse window as rain began to fall across Seoul. The city looked different to him now. Still beautiful, still dangerous, still full of people struggling to survive. But he saw it differently. Instead of seeing it as a landscape to conquer, he saw it as a community of human beings, each with their own story, their own suffering, their own right to exist without being preyed upon by men like he had been. Mercy rested at his feet, asleep, and Min-soo found himself grateful for the dog's presence. The animal had accomplished what no therapist, no spiritual advisor, no moral philosophy had been able to accomplish. It had made him feel. His phone buzzed with news alerts. The story of his transformation was spreading across the internet. Some people celebrated it as evidence that even the worst people could change. Others viewed it with cynicism, suggesting that it was a publicity stunt designed to rehabilitate his image. The truth, Min-soo understood, was somewhere in between. The changes he was making were genuine, but they were also motivated by a need to be seen, to be understood, to have his transformation acknowledged. That was a flaw he would carry to his grave, the inability to do good without needing recognition for it. He would spend the rest of his life trying to balance that flaw against his genuine desire to repair the damage he had caused. A message came through from Jinho. The Busan crew is requesting a formal negotiation about territories. They want to make an official agreement. Min-soo typed a response. Tell them I'm out. Tell them they have full control of the territories. We've discussed. I'm no longer in the criminal enterprise. There was a long pause before Jinho's next message. What will you do? Min-soo didn't have a complete answer to that question. He knew that he would continue the rebuilding work in the Western District. He knew that he would attempt to reach out to Zara Williams, though he had no idea how she would respond to hearing from the man responsible for her mother's death. He knew that he would somehow have to find a way to exist in Korean society as a man who had been stripped of his power, who had given up his empire, who had voluntarily stepped into a position of vulnerability and accountability. It would be harder than anything he had ever done. Harder than climbing to the top of Seoul's criminal underworld. Harder than building an empire. Harder than maintaining the emotional distance necessary to order deaths without blinking. But as he sat in his penthouse with Mercy sleeping at his feet, looking out at the rain-soaked city, Min-soo understood that hardness was the point. The distance he had traveled from the man he had been to the man he was becoming would be measured in difficulty, in discomfort, in the constant friction between his old nature and his emerging conscience. The puppy had done what the girl who trained it had intended. It had made him see. It had made him feel. And having finally learned to feel, Min-soo understood that the world could not be conquered or controlled. It could only be lived in, moment by moment, trying to cause as little harm as possible, attempting to repair the damage that had been done. 3 months after the memorial unveiling, Min-soo received a letter from Canada. It was postmarked from Vancouver, and the handwriting on the envelope was careful and deliberate. For several days he couldn't bring himself to open it. He placed it on his desk and looked at it each morning, trying to prepare himself for what it might contain. Finally, on a quiet evening, with Mercy at his side, he opened it. The letter was from Zara Williams. Dear Mr. Kang, I saw the news about the memorial, and about what you've done to rebuild the Western District. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel about it. I've spent the last 5 years in therapy trying to process my mother's death, trying to understand how someone could order a fire knowing that it would kill people. I've spent countless hours wondering who you were, what kind of human being could be so empty inside that you could destroy lives and feel nothing. And then you built a memorial. You put my mother's name on a wall, so that people would know she had existed. You are working to help the people in the neighborhood where she died. I don't know if that makes us even. I don't know if it erases what you did. But I trained Mercy to find you because I needed you to remember. I needed you to know on a cellular level what it felt like to have something you cared about threatened with destruction. I needed you to experience a fraction of the fear and helplessness that I felt watching my mother. Reading about what you've done, I think that part of what I set out to accomplish has worked. You remember now. You feel now. Mercy succeeded in her mission. I don't forgive you. I'm not sure I'm capable of forgiveness. But I acknowledge that you're trying. And I wanted to let you know that I see that effort. I recognize that it costs you something to dismantle what you built. And whatever happens next, at least you're not hiding anymore. My mother was a good woman. She saved lives. I wish I could have saved her. I wish you had never decided that her life was worth less than your ambitions. But I can't change the past. Neither can you. All we can do is what comes next. Thank you for letting her memory matter. Zara Williams *. Min-soo read the letter 3 times, and each time he read it, he understood it differently. The first reading was about what Zara was saying directly. Her acknowledgement that he was trying. Her refusal to grant him forgiveness. The second reading was about what she was implying, that his pain at losing the empire was a small price compared to what she had suffered. The third reading was about the space between the words, the space where both of them existed in a kind of shared grief, neither completely perpetrator nor victim anymore, just two humans trying to figure out how to exist with what had been done. That evening, Min-soo sat down and began to write a letter in response. He wrote about Amara Williams, trying to describe what he had learned about her from his investigation. He wrote about how she had saved lives as a nurse, how she had raised a daughter in difficult circumstances, how she had deserved more than the death he had ordered for her. He wrote about his realization that power was a kind of blindness, that it had required the intervention of a trained dog to help him see what he had been destroying all along. He wrote about Mercy, and how the puppy had served as a living link between him and the consequences of his actions. He wrote about the memorial wall and how he hoped it would serve as a daily reminder to anyone who passed through the Western District that human lives had value, that people mattered, that the price of ambition should never be paid in the blood of the innocent. And he wrote very carefully that he understood if Zara could never forgive him, that forgiveness was not something he was seeking, but rather acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that her mother had existed. Acknowledgement that Zara's pain was real and valid and something he would carry responsibility for the rest of his life. He didn't send the letter immediately. He read it multiple times, trying to make sure it struck the right balance between taking responsibility and not expecting absolution. When he was satisfied, he sealed it and addressed it to Zara in Vancouver. Then he sat back and waited to see if she would ever respond. A year after Mercy first followed him through the streets of Seoul, Min-soo was no longer a Mafia boss. The title was meaningless now. He had given up the operational control of his empire, had surrendered the money and the power and the fear that had sustained him. What had replaced it was something he was still learning to live with. Redemption, he had learned, was not a destination. It was a process, a constant navigation between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. It was a daily practice of sitting with his guilt, of acknowledging the harm he had caused, of attempting to repair what could be repaired and accept what could not be changed. The Western District of Seoul had transformed. Where there had once been exploitation and decay, there was now hope. The neighborhood was rebuilding. Young people were moving back. Businesses were opening. The community center that Min-soo had funded had become a hub for the neighborhood, a place where at-risk youth could receive counseling and support. And at the center of it all was the memorial wall, where Amara Williams's name was carved in stone, a permanent acknowledgement of her existence and her daughter's loss. Min-soo walked through the neighborhood with Mercy at his side, and he found that the dog's presence had changed. What had once been a symbol of judgment and accusation had become something more like companionship. The puppy had healed completely, and though it still limped slightly on its rear leg, it moved with confidence and purpose. As they walked, people recognized him. Some looked at him with the old fear, unable to shake the associations with his previous reputation. Others looked at him with something more like respect, acknowledging that he had taken the difficult path of transformation instead of the easy path of denial. A young man, maybe 17, approached them. He was the kind of kid who might once have been drawn to Min-soo's organization, looking for power and protection in a world that offered little of either. Instead, he had come through the community center. That's the famous dog, the young man said, looking down at Mercy. Change your mind about everything. The one that made you. Min-soo nodded. This is Mercy. She's a good dog. I heard she was trained by a girl. The young man said. Trained to find you and make you pay for what you did. I think that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. Like, she was a weapon made of love instead of violence. Min-soo hadn't thought about it that way before, but the young man was right. Mercy had been a weapon in her way. But her power wasn't to destroy. It was to reveal. It was to force someone to see what they had been avoiding, to feel what they had been trained not to feel, to become human again. Her name was Zara. Min-soo said quietly. Helping people like you. The girl who trained her. She's in Canada now. That's beautiful. The young man said. People. That her pain became something that helps other. After the young man walked away, Min-soo thought about that observation. Zara's pain, loss of her mother, the trauma of the fire, the years of grief, had been transformed into a tool for helping others and for driving Min-soo toward change. It had not erased her pain or made it meaningful in the sense of justifying it. But it had given shape to that pain, had allowed her to take what had been done to her and transform it into something that extended outward into the world, helping people she had never met. That was the only redemption available in a world where injustice was real and permanent. It was not the restoration of what had been lost, but the transformation of pain into purpose. 2 years after the memorial's unveiling, Min-soo received another letter from Zara. This one was shorter, and it arrived on his birthday. Dear Mr. Kang, I have decided to come back to Seoul. I've taken a position with an international organization that works to support victims of organized crime and their families. Part of my role will be working in the Western District, at the community center you funded. This doesn't mean I forgive you, but it means I'm ready to see you in person, to walk the same streets where my mother lived and died, and to work toward something that might approach justice. Mercy has become something of a legend here in Canada. Everyone wants to know about the dog that changed a mafia boss. I've been thinking about how to tell that story in a way that honors what my mother was, what I lost, and what you've become. I think the story matters. Not because it shows that redemption is possible. I'm not sure it is. Not completely. But because it shows that transformation is possible. That people can change. That even the worst of us can learn to feel again. I'm coming home to Seoul next month. I hope we can meet. Zara asterisk. When Min-soo read this letter, he found that his hands were shaking. The prospect of meeting Zara in person, of facing the daughter of the woman he had ordered killed, was terrifying in a way that even the threat of death had never been. He was no longer a man practiced in the language of power and control. He was a man learning, slowly and incompletely, how to be human. But he understood that meeting Zara was necessary. Not for him, but for her. She had initiated this process by training Mercy. She had set events in motion that had led to his transformation. And now she was coming to Seoul, returning to the place where her trauma had originated, to reclaim it, to transform it, to take her mother's death and her own survival and shape them into something that might help others. He wanted to tell her thank you. He wanted to tell her that her mother's death had not been in vain, that it had been the catalyst for change. But he understood that this was not about him. It was about Zara, and what she needed to do in order to move forward. The day Amara Williams arrived in Seoul, Min-soo stood in the Western District with Mercy at his side waiting. The neighborhood had transformed completely. The buildings had been carefully restored. Trees had been planted. A small park had been created around the memorial wall, a space where people could sit and reflect and remember. The community center was thriving, filled with young people receiving services and support. Zara walked down the street toward him, and Min-soo recognized her immediately from the photographs. She was a woman now, in her early 20s, with the same gravity in her expression that had been present when she was a girl. She was looking at the neighborhood with an expression that mixed grief and recognition, and something that might have been hope. When she reached him, they didn't shake hands. They didn't embrace. They simply stood for a moment, two people connected by tragedy and transformation, by the fire that had taken Amara's life, by the puppy that had brought them to this moment. "This is Mercy," Min-soo said, gesturing to the dog. Zara knelt down and placed her hands on the puppy's head, and Min-soo could see the tension leave her shoulders. She was reuniting with the animal she had trained, the weapon she had created out of love and loss. "She remembers you," Min-soo said. "I can tell. I spent 2 years with her," Zara said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of emotion beneath it. "I taught her every day. I recorded messages for her. I programmed her DNA, in a way, to recognize your face and pursue you relentlessly." She stood and looked at the memorial wall, at her mother's name carved in stone. "Thank you for this," she said. "To fix what you broke. Thank you for acknowledging what you did. Thank you for trying. It can't be fixed," Min-soo said quietly. "Your mother is still gone. Your childhood is still stolen. What I've done is not redemption. It's only the beginning of accountability." "I know," Zara said. "But you're right. It matters. It matters that you're trying. It matters that my mother's name is remembered. It matters that you're using your power now to help people, instead of destroy them." They stood together in the park, in the shadow of the memorial wall, with Mercy between them. A man learning to be human again, a woman learning to be whole after trauma, and a dog that had been the instrument of their connection. "What happens now?" Min-soo asked. "Now," Zara said. "I work. I help people. I live in the community that my mother died for, and I try to make sure that the next person who comes to power doesn't make the same choices you did." She turned to look at him directly. "And you continue. You continue to feel. You continue to remember. You continue to dismantle the systems that cause this harm, not because you expect forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do." Min-soo nodded. He understood. That evening he walked with Zara through the Western District, showing her everything that had been rebuilt, everything that had been created out of the ashes of the fire. She listened quietly, occasionally asking questions, occasionally stopping to look at a photograph on the memorial wall of someone else who had been lost to his operations. When they reached the community center, Zara went inside and spent hours familiarizing herself with the space, with the programs, with the young people who came there seeking help and support. Min-soo waited outside with Mercy, watching the sunset turn the Seoul sky into shades of orange and gold. The dog leaned against his leg, and Min-soo placed his hand on its head, grateful for its presence, grateful for what it had accomplished, grateful for the gift of second chances and the opportunity to spend the rest of his life trying to be less of a monster. When Zara emerged from the community center, she found Min-soo standing where she had left him, with Mercy at his side. She looked at the two of them, the man learning to be human, the dog that had taught him, and something that might have been forgiveness flickered across her expression. Not forgiveness of his crimes, Not absolution of his guilt, but acknowledgement that he was trying, that he had transformed, that Mercy had accomplished her mission. She's beautiful, Zara said, kneeling down to Mercy one more time. To do. She did what I needed her. She still does. Min-soo said. I'm trying not to be anymore. Every single day. She reminds me of what I was, what I did, what. Zara stood and looked at Min-soo with an expression of profound complexity, grief and understanding, and something that might eventually, given time, become a kind of peace. Thank you for rebuilding, she said. Mother's life and death mean something. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for letting my... Min-soo wanted to say more, wanted to express the full weight of his gratitude and his guilt and his ongoing effort to transform himself into someone worthy of the second chance that the black puppy had granted him. But he understood that words were not enough. Only actions mattered. Now, only the daily work of being better, of helping more, of causing less harm. He walked with Zara back to her temporary housing, and when they parted ways, Mercy remained pressed against his leg, a constant reminder of the girl who had trained her, the woman who had sent a message across time and distance, the power of love and loss, combined into a single, determined creature. As Min-soo walked home through the streets of Seoul, he thought about the concept of redemption. He had believed for so long that redemption was something that could be earned or achieved, a destination that could be reached through sufficient effort. But now he understood that it was not a destination. It was a journey. It was the daily practice of remembering, of feeling, of attempting to repair what could be repaired and accepting what could not be changed. The black puppy had found him and transformed him not through violence or intimidation, but through the simple act of being present, of being alive, of being a living symbol of the consequences of his actions. And as long as Mercy was at his side, as long as he could feel the warmth of her body against his leg, Min-soo would remember. He would feel. He would strive. Not for redemption, which might never come, but for the possibility of being, finally, a man worth saving. Subscribe to see what happens next in this story and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you and know how far our story is going. What do you think comes next for Min-soo and Zara? Will they ever find true peace together? Share your thoughts below. Your words matter in this journey of transformation.